Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the last of our sessions on really an introduction to Old Testament. It's a course that we might call an eisegesis course, sort of a broad overview of some of the pieces that are behind the reading to the Old Testament. Tonight, we're going to try and do a magic trick or to do the impossible or whatever it is. Nothing up my sleeve, but we're going to go through 1,000 years of history. And actually, that's just the first hour. 1,000 years of history. There are, depending on whether you count the queen or not, and whether you count a governor or not, 38 or 40 different rulers in the divided kingdom. And so in order to do that, it's sort of like galloping on horseback across the vast desert that's dotted with all kinds of interesting things. But we want to have a lot of time to pause. I love to tell the stories of Scripture. There are so many fascinating stories. This is like shackling my hands because I want to tell the stories that are related to this, but we're really going to look at some of the background narrative, but I've tried to present it in a way that will give you a flavor for some of the stories and hopefully invite you into the reading. If you're reading this, like 1st and 2nd Kings, for example, particularly 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then the books of the prophets, it may give new light to the kinds of things that you're reading. But last week with Pastor Dressler, you looked at the United Monarchy and the first, well, actually even before the monarchy, the rule of Saul and then David and Solomon. And what that means for the solidifying of the promise of the nation of Israel. Tonight we're going to look at the divided kingdom and what that means as a backdrop. And I'll try and draw some things together as we get closer to the end. But let's start with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings of this day. That even though it's foggy and rainy out here in Edmonton, we thank you that through the clouds and through the rain, you are there. That there's nothing that can stop you from shining your light, the light of Jesus Christ in our lives. As we look at what in many ways may seem like some of the darker ages in biblical history, we know that you were also there, also present, shining your light, that thin hope or the bright light of the promise of the Messiah. Remind us that even in our lives, in our daily life, regardless of the circumstances, your presence is there, particularly with the forgiveness of sin, the assurance of your love, and the claim that you've made on our lives to make us your own dear children. Lead us and guide us, that as we look at this background information, you would also help it enhance our understanding of you as the God of love, of mercy, and forgiveness. Through Jesus Christ we pray. I'll introduce the second half as we get to the second half, but let's take a look at the first half. First of all, just the next slide, this picture, you're gonna have to look around me, Adam. But this is the United Kingdom at the time of David's death, and you can see that, quite frankly, he had quite a large influence at that time. We're going to see, if I were to show you, and I won't, but it would be a fun thing to just show the way that the little picture of the kingdoms will shrink and enlarge over time. And part of the reason that I'm showing this slide, and the next one as well, is just to say that there's a greater context. That all of the things that we're looking at tonight are going to relate in some ways to the fact that there were other nations around them who had a significant influence. Sometime, and we'll see that, the influence of Aram, the influence of the rising, the continual presence of Egypt. Egypt continues to be a presence throughout this time, but we'll see Aram as an influence. We'll see the rise and strengthening of the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, the capital there, and then the growth of strength for Babylon and the Babylonian Empire, and what each of those does in terms of interplay and also how that plays out between the two kings in the two countries. The United Kingdom, as we've said, this was Solomon's kingdom, almost the same size. Really, they were united in part under Saul, united under David, and David set the foundation and groundwork so that the kingdom could really flourish under Solomon. But what often happens is that when you have a time of peace and prosperity, there can also be a time of decline that follows. And think about what that means even for our culture in our day. That happened in the life of David set it up. Solomon should have had great rule and he did have great prosperity, but we see the significant decline of the kingdom. Okay? Thank you. Thanks to Ken for being on the sidelines here, doing all the screening. Here we have the divided kingdom. First Kings records the unification, the united kingdoms of the three, Saul, David, and Solomon. But then there would be, in 2 Kings, this collapse and decline. And if you can see that here, we have the northern kingdom, Israel, not always centered in Samaria. We'll see that in the slides. But it would eventually, under Omri would buy the hill of Shemer and would name that Samaria. Samaria would become the capital. Jerusalem would be the capital of the southern kingdom in Judah. And one of the key things is that once the two nations divide, then it's not just the socio-political division, but particularly the religious division. Because what was different, and just throw this out, what was different about the worship life of Israel, the United Kingdom, from what we know today? One of the key things. Today we can worship where?
Anywhere.
We can worship anywhere. Now they could worship anywhere to a sense, but we can worship in any congregation in almost any community, right? But one of the things that's really unique about the nation of Israel was that they had how many temples? Just one. And that's located where? In Jerusalem. So when you separate the northern kingdom away from Jerusalem, you're really cutting off the people from their worship life. And you'll see that under Jeroboam. That's why I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. The northern 10 tribes, there are 10 tribes that become the northern kingdom. And there are 2 tribes. It's Judah and then what's left of the remnant of Benjamin that become the southern kingdom. But what there also happens is we see that some of the faithful people in the northern kingdoms of those 10 tribes drifted down to Jerusalem so that they could, and they would be received there, but they drifted down there, they moved down there so that they could have access to the worship life. Okay? Next slide. Just to say that the divided kingdom and its neighbors, we see Israel, we see Judah, there's the Aram Damascus, the Ammonites, we see the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Edom, the Arubu tribes are down, and then Egypt is this direction, the Philistine coast, Phoenicia up to the northern area. All of those play a role at one point or another in how the two kingdoms would play out. But largely we'll see that the big players that make some of the biggest difference. We'll see Aram, Damascus, and we'll also see up to the northeast both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and then the Egyptian role that plays in as well. Okay? Sorry if it seems like I'm rushing, it's because I am. So the kingdom divides. And basically 931, 930, roughly. So from there until, well, really we're going to cover about 600 years. It's not quite 1,000. I was a little bit exaggerating. But what happens with the whole kingdom, Solomon's son was Rehoboam. Rehoboam didn't really have a good handle on how to rule. He had a number of contemporaries his age whom he asked, how should I rule? And that was pitted against Solomon's advisors. Solomon's advisors said your father Solomon was harsh. ease up a little bit and the people will follow you. His own contemporaries said, don't ease up, then they'll take advantage of you. Instead, be even harsher. And Rehoboam listened to his own contemporaries rather than Solomon's advisors, and he became more harsh and cruel. He turned pagan, the kingdom split. Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's administrators, basically, it was prophesied to him that he would take 10 of the 12 tribes, and he did. But then, as we said, with no access to the Jerusalem temple, what he did as a result was set up in Bethel and in Dan, in two parts of the northern kingdom. He set up worship sites. And what he did for that is made 2 golden calves. Sound familiar? Remember that this is maybe a little bit PG rated, but what is it about a bull that makes it such a sign of power? It's not just the big horns and the broad shoulders, but what's a bull in an agrarian society?
Pushy.
What's that? Pushy, yeah, and also threatening, intimidating. What else? Dangerous. And it's the bull that impregnates all the cows, right? So he's literally the big stud, right? And so the bull, oftentimes in the ancient Near East artwork or carvings, the bull has exaggerated genitals, right? As a sign of being fertile. And you would try to please the fertility god so that he would bless your crops and your herds, right? And that same thing is going to be true in the high places. Those were fertility cults. The Baal was oftentimes symbolized by a huge, tall phallic symbol. Sorry, again, PG-13 or whatever this is. And the Ashtaroths, enlarged breasts, sometimes an open hole around the womb area. And what happened with these pagan cultic idolatries is that oftentimes there were the prostitution, right? Male and female prostitutes. So the guy would say, well, I need to go to the temple so we have a good crop, and his wife might say, well, bless you, as you go off there. I have to do it, honey, you know. But it's all part of what's happening. Jeroboam didn't want the people to become irreligious, but he set up a religion that would basically lead them astray from the fear of God. So Jeroboam takes away from Rehoboam 10 of the tribes, right? Now, you might say, what's going to happen here? We're going to see different short-term dynasties and rulers here. There is not a true dynasty that goes all the way to the end of the nation of Israel. But there is with Judah, and often repeated in 2 Kings, but especially in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we read the line that for the sake of my servant David, God says, I will not completely abandon his descendants. And so for the sake of David, and was David a perfect ruler?
No.
Not at all. But for the sake of David, God has this relationship with David, and for the sake of David, there's always going to be, till the final Babylonian captivity, there's always going to be a descendant of David who rules on the throne, except for Athaliah. Okay? Yeah, there was war during Rehoboam's time with Egypt. We're going to see some of the players going back and forth under Pharaoh Shishak. After Rehoboam, 3 years of rule under Abijah, who was unfaithful. So we see this pattern. Solomon begins to stray, Rehoboam strays, and you'd think, Jeroboam has strayed overtly. Rehoboam has also strayed. He's allowing, and in fact also encouraging, the worship on the high places. Right? And Abijah does the same thing, but especially under Abijah we see this warfare that's taking place that increases between the two nations. It had been there with Rehoboam, and then it continued under Abijah. By the way, it's always going to be, the left column is going to be Judah until Israel is no more. The right column is going to be Israel. We're going to track this through. Nadab only ruled for 1 year. He was unfaithful. He was the end of the Jeroboam line. He was killed by Baasha, one of the generals, and that's the end of the Jeroboam line. Okay? I just threw in a couple artifacts here. This is a stele showing the storm god Baal, and the Baal wasn't always represented by the phallic symbol, but he's also the god of the storm. So when it thunders and it lightnings and it's a big powerful wind and all those strong signs, that's also a representation of the Baal. So the calf or the phallic symbol or this god of the storm with his whip. Okay, next one. There's another one. Here's another stele. It's of Mesha, king of Moab, and basically this, what makes this is not an art piece, but it's a different kind of obelisk that really basically gives mention to King Ahab. Sometimes we think the Bible is just an isolated text all by itself. There's nothing else in history that relates to it. What archaeological evidence shows us is that even from nations outside of Israel, there are sometimes very oblique, but little references which give strength to the biblical account. And it also helps us with dating. If we want to know if we have records that corroborate, we do that. Next one, Ken. So it continues. Asa ruled after Abijah 42 years. He began as a good king, but he began to drift later on. I've got my own little cheat sheets, but they're so small that it's easier for me to turn around. So does this bother you if I turn around and read it off here?
Fine.
It's just, I should have made them much bigger. But anyway, so Asa tears down the altars on the high places, but then he's trying to get protection, and so he tries to gain the loyalty of Ben-Hadad of Aram. Ben, by the way, is even in Aramaic. Ben is in both the related Semitic languages. It's a sign of strength and sonship. In Hebrew, Ben is son. But this is Ben-Hadad of Aram. He had sided with Israel, helped recapture Ramah, but this dependence, it becomes a weakness for Asa. And then Asa pays tribute to Assyria. Again, you see these competing cultural powers that are there. But from years 10 to 35 of his reign, there's essential peace that's going on. The first 10 years were filled with battle. Then the latter years, you see the middle part is peaceful, then the latter years had more conflict. The end of Asa's life, he contracted a foot disease. 2 Chronicles 16 says this thing that he's sort of chastised in 2 Chronicles 16, because what did he do? In spite of this deep affliction, he doesn't seek the help of the Lord, but instead he goes to the physicians. Food for thought. Does that mean we shouldn't go to physicians? No, it's not necessarily true, but where do we put our faith and trust? God works through the physicians, but that's a commentary on the attitude of Asa through the chronicler. And by the way, the kings represents both kingdoms, north and south kingdom, but if you read Chronicles, it's basically the perspective of the northern kingdom, because it's the chronicle or the chronicler of Judah from Jerusalem, who's basically telling the story of the southern kingdom. So you'll see corroborating information, but sometimes Chronicles sort of whitewashes some of the bad facts about Jerusalem and the Judean king. It makes it seem more palatable. to make them look better, because they're, again, giving the official court record of Judah, of Jerusalem. In the northern kingdom, Baasha served for 23 years. He was a captain of Nadab, murdered Nadab, but he extended the pagan idolatry. There's continual war with Judah. At first, he has the support of Aram, Ben-Hadad, and then Ben-Hadad is bought away by Asa. Elah only served for 2 years. He's another bad pagan king. Scripture says he was killed while he was in a drunken stupor, wasn't able to defend himself. But he was killed by Zimri, who wasn't exactly Mr. Popular. He only survived 1 week. And that was after he killed all the rest of Baasha's family. The whole of Israel saw what he had done and rebelled against him, didn't approve of what happened. So Zimri burns down the palace around him in order to avoid being tortured or having a more painful death. It's just one of those things. Okay? Next. Then we come, is it okay if I just sort of go Judah and then Israel? Does that work? I just threw in some artwork just because I thought it would be interesting and sort of break it up. As I tried to compare where in the lineage things went, how they compared, I had some white spaces and I filled them in. This is really a painting of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the fire that comes down from heaven. Jehoshaphat served for 24 years. He's a good king. He's strong and he's fair. He was co-regent. Now again, this line is all or mostly fathers and sons. Sometimes uncles or brothers would reign one after the other. But he's the son of Asa, and he co-reigned with his father. But that was after Asa got the disease in his feet. He asked his son to rule with him. It was during that time that Ben-Hadad, the second servant, Naaman, is healed. And but interestingly enough, he joins forces. So some of the warfare begins to decline. And when they see that they have a common enemy with Aram, he sides with Ahab, who's a very wicked Israelite king. He sides with Arab to fight Aram. Ahab to fight Aram. I don't know what I said. It didn't sound like. My brain said I didn't say it right. Timni is the next in line in Israel. Timni had support of some of the tribes until he was defeated. He ruled for 5 years. He was defeated by Omri, who lived for 11 years. It was under the rule of Omri that the hill of Shamer was bought, and he put his palace there. And that from then on, we see the introduction of that northern kingdom as Samaria with the center there. He strengthened pagan worship by by building additional altars on the high places. Generally, those high places, familiar with Psalm 121? I lift up my eyes to the hills, right? Yeah, quite possibly, I think likely, that the psalmist there is saying, I lift up my eyes to the hills, right? But there's nothing there. It's the maker of the hills that I worship, right? So here we have, the worship was on the high places. The high places were theoretically closer to the storms, right? And the god of the storms, or the god who's in heaven. So they found the high places. They built altars there, put the phallic symbol or the statues up there. This altar was probably on one of the high places, the altar to Baal. And that's basically the way this northern kingdom is going. We're seeing that since they can't go to Jerusalem and worship the one true God, they're doing whatever works for them. King Ahab, son of Omri, lives for 21 years. And he's considered to be, he's often the prototype of one of the worst of the kings of Israel, right? Partly because he married Jezebel. And Jezebel introduces all kinds of additional pagan worship. He was opposed by Elijah and Elisha, but this odd little thing, Ahab sort of sidles up to Elijah in a few instances. Asks for advice, hopes that he will get some kind of blessing, but he doesn't really have any kind of consistent, sincere faith relationship. In that northern kingdom at that time, while Elijah and Elisha are serving, it gets so bad when all the prophets of God have a price on their head that Elijah says, I'm the only one left, right? I'm the only faithful man left. And Ahab's servant says, no, I've hidden away 700 others, right? You're not alone, which I think is a really helpful thing for us to remember. Sometimes we feel like all alone, right? And when we think that, God will continue to preserve his land, his people. It's Ahab who, if you know the story of Naboth and his vineyard, I'll get to this a little bit in the second part, but the vineyard was an inheritance from the Lord. It was part of his connection to the promised land, right? And so he couldn't rightfully sell it, even if he wanted to. What does King Ahab do? With his wife's coaching, he accuses Naboth of being unfaithful to God and to the king, and he steals the vineyard. Ahab dies in battle at Ramoth Gilead. He fought the famous Battle of Karkar. If you've heard of that, that's all part of this tension that's going on between the nations. Next, Ken. Just thought, these are some of the ruins of Samaria. You probably can't see them very well. There were smaller pictures. They're a little bit grainy. But you can see that the ruins show a little bit of the topography. The hillside behind there, they always, it's always easier to defend the hill, right? And you want water, you want defendability. And so those are some of the things that you'll see around Samaria. Next. Okay, continuing in the southern kingdom, this is where it starts to get a little confusing. All right? Or even more confusing, because what do you see on this slide? Southern kingdom, Jehoram, Joram. Here in the northern kingdom, Joram, Jehoram.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah, right.
They're different people. And sometimes it refers to one or the other name for both of them. So you have trouble keeping these buggers straight. Not only that, what do you have? Ahaziah in both kingdoms. Right? Who's who in this whole jungle? Right? Well, try to present this. Again, the Judean, the southern kingdom's Jehoram, and I put that name first because that's what is the most often used name. Served 8 years from 848 to 841. He killed his 6 brothers in order to reign. So this is in the southern kingdom, the faithful kingdom. This is Judah, right? Not without its problems. He married Athaliah, Ahab's daughter. Remember her name. Tuck that away because that's going to come out a little bit later, right? But this is King Ahab's daughter. Not only Ahab, but who was Ahab's wife? Jezebel. See a problem developing here? Right? So you've got Jehoram, who kills his brothers, marries the daughter of one of the most pagan couples in the northern kingdom, but suddenly you've got what going between here? A relationship by marriage, right? What does that do when you have grandkids in the other kingdom?
It's a problem.
It creates a false sense of peace sometimes,
Yeah,
right?
sure, exactly.
So this is a kind of treaty agreement, right? They're thinking this is a great coup, right? Because now finally we'll be able to have some kind of peace. See if that peace is long-standing. Because remember, who do we have? You've got to become kind of pagan to live with the family, the in-laws,
Yes.
right? You don't marry just the daughter, you marry the whole family.
You killed
He was a weak king, he was not faithful, there's war on every side, with Edom, with Ethiopia, with Philistia, with the Arabian tribes, a loose federation of tribes. It's not a very good time. He was succeeded by Ahaziah, or also known as Jehoash. And there's going to be Joash and Jehoash, all these names kind of pulled together here. He only served for 1 year. He takes what Jehoram had started and makes it worse. He introduces more of the pagan idolatry. But what do you expect, right? Because what have you introduced into this lineage? This whole family that brings their gods with them, right? So Judah has a fairly downward spiral at this point. Ahaziah also, this slipped up to the top on my PowerPoint, sorry about that. He partners with Joram, and it really should be down here, but he's finally killed by, the southern kingdom is killed by the next usurper to the throne of the northern kingdom, Jehu. We'll get to that in a bit. But he's finally, because he partnered with Joram, and that's just a whole kind of a messy thing. The northern kingdom's king, Ahaziah, only ruled for 2 years. He was the son of Ahab and Jezebel. So what do you have here, right? You've got brother and sister. Did they get along? Sometimes not. You know how brothers and sisters can be. But he partners with Jehoshaphat to build trading ships. But those ships never sailed. He died. He fell from his patio. He survived, but he was seriously injured. Died eventually from those injuries. But he consulted the gods of Ekron over on the coast, and he was confronted by Elijah for going to the false gods rather than going to the one true God. Okay, you see kind of that mess. Is this making sense? The two kingdoms, or is this? It's kind of messy. I packed so much into these that I hope it's not too much. Then you have the northern kingdom's Joram, and he's most often referred to first by Joram, but also Jehoram. So it's just a messy text to read. And when you're doing it in the Hebrew, it's even more messy, right? Because you're translating, you're saying, who in the world is this? And you have to get the context. But he ruled for 12 years. He's another one of the sons of Ahab Jezebel. So he's married to, or he's brother to Athaliah. You see this relationship and how it's connected. He's also then going to be the uncle of Ahaziah of Judah. Together they went to battle against Aram to retake Ramoth Gilead. Right? He's wounded by Aram. And then after that, he's killed by Jehu. And Jehu, we'll get to in a minute, but he gets this anointing, the prophet of God, saying he would take over. And so he goes about his task of killing both kings of both kingdoms, basically eliminating. Jehu, in some ways, is the most like. I should get to the next slide. Let me finish this. Joram worshipped the golden calves, but not Baal. He made that distinction. He sort of excluded the Baal, but he's still doing the pagan worship. Let's go to the next slide, because I want to pick up a little bit. I'm going to go to the Israel side first, if I can, because I started talking about Jehu. Jehu is a lot like the Old Testament judges. The judges in the Old Testament were not people who settled civil court cases. They were military generals, essentially. In the judges, in the era of the judges, before the kings came into existence, God would raise up a military general or someone who took military strength and judged on behalf of God against the unbeliever. Right? So Samson, as Pastor Dressler said last week, I think, yeah, it must have been last week that he covered that. But Samson is one of the most famous of the judges. He is God's agent to judge against the Philistines, right? And drive the Philistines out to enhance the kingdom of Israel. So Jehu is, functionally, he's like one of the judges, but he becomes king of the northern tribe. So he kills both kings, basically judging against the house of Ahab and Jezebel, right? He's judging against those, both Ahaziah and Joram, as well as, what does he do? The text says when he rides into Samaria, Jezebel is there, and he calls out, throw her down. This is a different kind of PG rating, but he calls down, throw her down. And they threw her down out of the upper window, and then he drove over her on his chariot, and the birds came and ate her flesh. Jehu is intending to do the right thing. He's zealous for God. I put this in there. He drives like a madman. When they, and this is out of the biblical text. It's fascinating. You know, Vern is kind of chuckling because you're familiar with that story too. Who are those chariots coming? They're coming across the desert. Well, one drives like a madman. He must be Jehu, right? He had a reputation. He drove like a madman. Comes right out of the text. But anyway, he's zealous for God at first, but he tolerated the golden calves at both Dan and Bethel as well. So the idolatry continues. He's got the same problem though, because there isn't really a reunification of the two nations. And he's hesitant to let the people go to Jerusalem to worship because then their loyalty might shift away. He might lose part of his kingdom, right? So you see the dynamics. Throughout his time, he struggled with Aram. But what's happening is that Aram is beginning to lose its power. Assyria is beginning to rise. And so that's a key thing. I'm going to continue on the northern kingdom. Jehoahaz ruled for 17 years. You see, these are fairly long tenures. When you think about the instability of that era, I mean, we see these little shorties that come in. They're 1 week or 1 year or 6 months, but these are some fairly long tenures. Jehoahaz is a little bit of a bright light, at least at first. He is originally faithful, but later influenced by sort of this sense of what's going on around him, he reinstates the Asherah poles. The Asherah and the Ashtaroths, different names for a similar related goddess, the goddess of fertility. He struggled with Aram, King Hazael, and Ben-Hadad both, but even so, Aram is beginning to reduce its strength. But what happens is that Jehoahaz gradually sees the decline of his own power. So finally, at the end, he's left with really only a small force, 50,000 foot soldiers, 50 chariots. There's really not a lot compared to what they once had in their days of might and strength, right? That's the northern kingdom. You can see that little bright light, but it begins to decline, and it's really, this kingdom is just basically pagan in a lot of what it does, with those golden calves, with the high places. And you'll see in the prophets, there is, Isaiah particularly continues to hammer away at the stuff that's taking place at the high places, that pagan idolatry. Southern kingdom. So what has happened? Ahaziah gets killed, right, by Jehu, but it's not quite everyone, because there's still this, who is she? The daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And she self-declares, she kills off all of the rightful heirs, and she declares herself to be, first of all, she was queen mother with Ahaziah, and then she reigned as queen for roughly 6 years. But what she didn't realize is that when she had given the order to kill all the rightful heirs, one escaped, was protected actually, and his aunt Jehosheba, who was married to the high priest Jehoiada, snuck him away, protected him, for 6 years, kept it quiet. Athaliah didn't know. And then you have, here's a little artwork. Here's Jehoiada, here's the little 7-year-old Josiah, or Joash rather. Josiah's later on. This is Joash and Queen Athaliah. And what happens is that Jehoiada sets it up so that he tells all the servants who were serving at the temple that day, all the Levites, this is what I'm going to do. He brought Joash into the kingdom. Whether he sat him down on the throne there or not is immaterial. Probably didn't happen quite this way. But he declared him to be king, and then when Athaliah tried to challenge that, the Levites killed her, Athaliah. So Joash, also a secondary name, ruled for 40 years. Now here's one of the sad pieces about this lineage in the kings. As long as the high priest Jehoiada was alive and guiding Joash's decisions, he was a good king, seemed to be a very good king. But the biblical text says once Jehoiada died and was no longer advising him, when Joash went out on his own, he began to stray. And that's a sad commentary. Okay? Next. After Joash, I'm going to go back to Judah, the southern kingdom, is Amaziah, 29 years. Again, he began to faithfully follow Yahweh, defeated the Edomites. But what does he do? What often happens? You conquer the land, you take what? The treasures, and what are the treasures? Gods, right? They're made of gold, right? So you take those, and you get them back home, and you say, well, I can't smelt this. I can't cut it up. I guess I'll have to put it somewhere, right? And then you begin to think, well, maybe, well, it's a whole progressive thing. But those gods end up taking the thought process and eventually getting attention and focus. Amaziah challenges Jehoash to a fight. Now, Jehoash is the more powerful at that time. Jehoash says, what are you doing? Just leave me alone. Let's live at peace together, right? But Amaziah, thinking that he's trying to do this noble thing and restore the kingdom, challenges Jehoash to a fight. He loses, and then what Jehoash does, from the northern kingdom, he significantly damages the wall of Jerusalem and the temple. Amaziah, at the end of his life, was killed by assassins. He ended up not being very popular, made some poor decisions. And we can say, well, of course, he's following false gods, but it's not even as simple as that. After Amaziah comes Uzziah. Uzziah is, in many ways, one of the good kings, largely. What you'll see is, in Greek mythology, all of the gods and all of the heroes they were good, except they had what? One flaw, right? Everybody had a flaw. We'll see that's true with even the best of the kings end up having something that is a flaw in their character or a flaw in their judgment. And with Uzziah, he reigned for 52 years. He's really faithful to God. He works with the prophet Zechariah. This is a long tenure. This is one of the most prosperous eras. He rebuilds Jerusalem, fortifies its cities, its ramparts, its terraces. He built machines to defend her against the enemies. So he's using his prosperity to strengthen the kingdom. But later in life, he becomes arrogant. So here's what he thinks. And tell me who this may remind you of. He enters the inner sanctuary of the temple, where he's going to offer sacrifices, right? He goes in and does what's rightfully the duty of whom? Who's supposed to do this? It's the priest. He goes in and says, I can do this, I'm the king. There's an earthquake when this happens, and he's struck with leprosy, and he's confronted by the high priest and the rest of the priests, and he is really, the text says he's eager to get out. At that point, he
I
realizes.
didn't know that earthquakes could cause leprosy.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Yeah, stay away from earthquakes. You can get leprosy from it. No, they're unrelated. What's that?
Simultaneous.
Yeah, simultaneous occurrences. Yeah. From then on, his son reigned with him. So this is a co-regency. Some of those 52 years were co-regency. But who does that remind you of?
Saul.
King Saul, doesn't it? Remember?
Yeah.
Saul's waiting for Samuel to come. He waits, and then he says, I'll just offer the sacrifices myself. And God says, God through Samuel says, no. You're not the one who was to offer those sacrifices. And so I think there's a recurring theme that happens here. Northern Kingdom continues. There's this duplicity with Jehoash. Right? Another one of those names that we've seen before, right? You've got Jehoash. This one is Jehoash before Joash. This is the Northern Kingdom. Outwardly, he made all the impressions that he was worshiping God, the one true God. But privately, he worshipped the golden calves, and he continued to worship the Edomite gods, the gods that had been brought in through victory. He outwardly honored Elisha, visited him, was confronted by Elisha, but he didn't really heed what Elisha said in any of those confrontations. He attacks, we said this already, he attacked or fought against Amaziah. He actually won, damaging the city wall and the temple. He took out the temple treasures, right? Unfortunately, when you capture the treasures of the Edomite gods, you begin to worship them. That didn't seem to follow suit with the temple treasures of Jerusalem. Then comes Jeroboam the second. Remember, the first of the kings had been Jeroboam the first that took over from Rehoboam. Jeroboam the second ruled for 41 years. At that time, this was one of the most prosperous eras. And you can see this, Uzziah's time and Jeroboam the second, that was basically what's happening is Egypt is on a period of decline, Aram is on a period of decline, Assyria hasn't grown to its full power yet, Babylon is yet some time away from its power, and so these two kingdoms are really fairly autonomous during this time period, right? It's a very prosperous area, trade was good, but Jeroboam was a bad king. He worshipped the golden calves. He worshipped Hashem, one of the other foreign gods. He is said to have oppressed the poor or allowed the oppression of the poor, orphans, widows. He's confronted. This is the era of Hosea, Joel, Jonah, Amos, actually for both of the kingdoms. But Amos is, Amos is famous for saying, you shouldn't be oppressing the poor. Assyria hasn't reached world power, but it continues to rise. Next. So after, in the southern kingdom, the next king is Jotham. He reigned for 16 years. Part of that was co-regency with his father, Uzziah. He inherited essentially a strong kingdom. He was another builder, continued to use the wealth to strengthen and fortify Jerusalem. He was the builder of the famed Jerusalem Gate. Developed cities in the mountains, established castles, towers in the forests. He fought, toward the end, against Pekah. It was during his time that Isaiah and Hosea also were actively involved. The northern kingdom continues its decline. You went from having longer periods of rule to shorter periods of rule. Zechariah was only in for 6 months. Very little known about him. He's just not enough to even be mentioned in the scriptures. Shallum only ruled for, Shallum killed Zechariah. he only ruled for 1 month before he was ruled by, or killed by Menahem. So you see this sort of quick succession and unrest, and so people are reading the daily newspaper and saying, who's the king today? Menahem rules in Samaria for 10 years. He's this pretty violent military general. He actually was one of the better kings. He tried to be faithful to God, or at least gave lip service to it, but he still worshipped the golden calves. After him was Pekahiah, 2 years, who also ruled from Samaria. And that's the reason I put that in is because of Pekah, who has this co-regency with both of them, but I didn't know how to put this up better on a chart. Pekahiah mixed Yahweh worship with Jeroboam's sin, so he's trying to he tries to unite all the religions, try to be United Church or whatever. Unite all the religions and say, this is what we're going to do, Unitarian or whatever it is, we're going to make it all the same and have a simplified worship. It's just too complex to have different religious practices. But it didn't work. Now, here you have 12 years from Samaria, but Pekah has pulled away some of the tribes and is ruling at the same time as Menahem and Pekahiah is Pekah, and eventually he would eliminate, Pekah would eliminate Pekahiah, and he would rule by himself for 8 years. But he ruled from Gilead, and then it would eventually go back to Samaria. He divided the north, ruled Gilead, I guess I've said that, bad king, and it was during his reign that the prophets Amos and Micah had a lot of their words. Next. So, we might go a little bit past the 8 o'clock time, but I'll try and catch that up. We won't keep you till midnight or anything quite like that. So I'm gonna finish out the northern kingdom. So you have then Hoshea, who ruled for 11 years. He tried to be faithful. He conspired against Pekah, kills him. He takes over Ephraim, but not the whole kingdom. Some of these tribes have never really, or haven't fully come back. But he works with the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser, who he hopes that by uniting with Assyria, they can have this unified fight against Egypt. Now you see some of the world powers that are coming into play. But then he shifts his tribute. So how does this sound? I'm gonna side with you and give money to you in Assyria. And then suddenly, and we're going to fight against Egypt, and suddenly I'm going to switch and give my money over to Egypt. How do you think that's going to settle with Tiglath-Pileser? Right? So he shifts from Assyria to Egypt in rebellion against Shalmaneser. Right? And guess what? He made the wrong choice. Right? Because what do we have happening here? Egypt is sort of always there, right? And so it's always the go-to for the children of Israel. But he miscalculated the Assyrian growth and the Assyrian strength and shifted to Egypt, and Egypt lost. Shalmaneser V lays siege to Samaria for 3 years. Hoshea is killed. Even though Sargon II, in other records, Sargon takes credit for it. There's no evidence that Sargon was actually there at the time of the fall of Samaria. So it's likely under Shalmaneser's reign. This ends the northern kingdom. This is about 722, 721 BC. What happens is that the people, when the Assyrians come in, it was their strategy to carry away a majority of the people, leave enough to sort of till the land, but carry away the people from their homeland, and then they would do this swap and bring in captives from other parts of their territory. And so it was this whole mixture of different languages, different peoples. And what happened is that these other peoples, these outsiders who were also captured by the Assyrians, intermarried with the sort of Jewish bloodline that remained in the northern kingdom, and they became the hated half-breeds, the Samaritans, right? And that's part of the Samaritan dislike. They were half-breeds because they weren't faithful. Okay? The end of the northern kingdom, right here. Southern kingdom continues. Ahaz, not Ahab, but Ahaz, has this diplomatic battle. He's sort of caught between Pekah. Syria is also rising in power. King Rezin. And they tried to form this coalition against Assyria as well. They resist. They're fighting Tiglath-Pileser against, and then he shifts and fights against Syria and Samaria. Tiglath-Pileser is defeated, defeats Damascus and wins, but Ahaz becomes a vassal, or he becomes subject to Tiglath-Pileser, to Assyria, and has to pay this huge tribute. He claimed to be faithful, but began worshiping the Assyrian gods to stay in the favor of Tiglath-Pileser, right? And the Assyrians were there. Isaiah confronts Ahaz, asking him to rely on God, not outside help, but Ahaz doesn't really respond well. Isaiah has the ear of the king, but doesn't really get listened to. Then comes Hezekiah, one of the really good kings in the southern kingdom, ruled for 29 years. He's one of the best known. He saw all this implode and had significant interactions with Isaiah the prophet. Next slide. He purifies and repairs the temple. He purges Judah of idolatry and pagan practices at the high places, golden calves. The Nehushtan, that's an interesting thing that creeps in. It's the serpent that was on a pole. Remember that in the book of Numbers? It became an idol. And you don't hear much of it, but it becomes this idol that carries through to the time of Hezekiah. So this is late 8th century. And it's all sort of imploding. But Hezekiah gets rid of the Nehushtan. He reforms the Levitical priesthood, restores the Jewish practices, circumcision, sacrifice, prayers, feast days. But in the 14th year of his reign, he becomes ill. He's told he's going to die. He prays to God, and God says, I'll give you 15 more years. It sort of gives... You never tell a guy how long he's going to live, because then he becomes arrogant, right?
Yeah.
His kingdom, his power, his prestige extend. But Hezekiah foolishly opens up and shows the storehouses of his wealth, the wealth of the temple, the wealth of his kingdom. And so he became sort of a sitting duck for Sennacherib. He partners with Sennacherib, but also did his own work to fortify the walls. He dug this tunnel, this water tunnel, so that if they were ever laid under siege, they would have access to water. And so Sennacherib lays siege to Jerusalem, but can't conquer it. And when Sennacherib goes home, he's assassinated, so Jerusalem has a little bit of relief. Okay? After him is Manasseh. Manasseh starts, this is the opposite of what we see in so many patterns. He starts bad, but ends up good at the end. He's co-regent with Hezekiah for 10 years. He's good while he's co-regent. Once his father dies, he just reverses everything, goes to paganism. He tries to get in with Sennacherib and his son Esarhaddon. He pays tribute, but also takes on the gods and the goddesses. Judah lives in peace and prosperity. It's kind of a most favored status with the Assyrians. And he even went so far as to restrict the Jewish feasts, the sacrifice, the temple worship. He restores worship on the high places and the altars. He persecutes the priests and prophets of Yahweh. He introduces this plurality, including the Chemosh, the sacrificing children to the fire. He's chastised in the Bible. They'll often use him as a reference point. Almost as bad as Manasseh. Right? Manasseh becomes equal to this horrible pagan. But he withheld tribute to Assyria, was brought in chains to Assyria. They threatened him with death. He vowed to restore order and was allowed back on his throne. At that point, amazingly, after he realizes that the Assyrians are not going to be kind to him, even though he's worshiping their gods, he repents. And he begins to restore Yahweh worship in Israel. Okay? Then comes Ammon, who's there, rules for 2 years. He returns Judah to pagan practices. Doesn't have to work very hard. A lot of it is there. He's killed by his servants for his cruelty and idolatry. Then comes another one of the really good kings. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth. Josiah rules 31 years. He's only 8 when he begins to reign. 18 years into his rule, he's working with a really good high priest, Hilkiah. He instructs Hilkiah to use the temple treasury to rebuild and remodel the temple. And while they're doing that, they discover the scriptures. Probably a portion of Deuteronomy. Josiah reads them and takes them to heart. He's confronted with the law and takes it seriously. So he initiates this deep spiritual reform throughout the nation. Assyria is beginning to decline, so Judah has this kind of autonomy. But at the same time, Pharaoh Necho II begins to rise in power, attacks Assyria. Josiah meddles in, right? He's warned not to, but he engages and he's killed by an Egyptian arrow at Megiddo. But Nineveh ends up falling to Assyria in 612. Falling to Babylon. I had Assyria. This is the Assyrian Empire, the 8th and 9th centuries. Just a picture of how broad and vast it is and what that includes. Sort of, you can see they're on the boundary, sometimes on and sometimes off. Okay. Southern kingdom is beginning the last of its decline. Jehoahaz, 3 months, he's been appointed by Josiah as the successor. He's the younger brother of he and Jehoiakim, but when Necho II comes through, he takes him back to Egypt with him as a prisoner. And he puts Jehoiakim in place. Necho puts Jehoiakim in place, the older brother. Jehoiakim was not a very good ruler. Josiah probably knew the difference between the two brothers and intentionally appointed Jehoahaz because it would have been the better ruler. Jehoiakim taxed the people, was under heavy tribute. He shifts his loyalties between Egypt, goes from Egypt to Babylon, but then pays even heavier tribute to Babylon. So he's switching back and forth, Egypt to Babylon, back to Egypt when Nebuchadnezzar fails to conquer Egypt. Jerusalem was laid siege in 605. Jehoiakim happens to die before the siege is over. His body is thrown over the city wall. But at the end of that siege was the first deportation to Babylon. And that's probably when Daniel went, in that first deportation. There would be really 2-3 waves where that would happen. He was not faithful to Yahweh. He was labeled as a godless tyrant. Records indicate that he was incestuous with his mother, his sister, his daughter. Killed men for their wives. This is the Babylonian Empire. So the Assyrians were the ones who conquered the northern kingdom. The Babylonians are rising in power and will eventually take the southern kingdom. Next. Jehoiachin. There's Jehoiakim who came earlier. This is Jehoiachin. He only rules for 3 months. He was the son of Jehoiakim. He's deposed by Nebuchadnezzar when Jerusalem is invaded in 597. And now Jehoiachin is also carried off to battle. At this time, many of the faithful nobility and aristocracy are captured and led to Babylon as well. Probably in this deportation. Very likely, possibly, the prophet Ezekiel, or the priest Ezekiel, went off to Babylon. I don't know if that's is where you place that, Vern, or not, but likely either there or in 587. I think it's more likely that it was in 597. The end of the kingdom would happen in 587, so this is 10 years before the kingdom ended, but they're just continuing to siphon off some of the best believers. Then Zedekiah is appointed as governor. He's age 21 when he begins to reign. He used Jeremiah as his advisor, but didn't always listen to or heed his words. He depended on others, not God, practiced some pagan idolatry. His epitaph said he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He was essentially just a vassal of Babylon, or a servant, ruler, a governor. He was influenced by Ben-Neriah. Zedekiah partnered with Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. It's not usually a good thing. Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem in 587, destroys the city in 587, 586. Zedekiah and the remaining leaders tried to escape, but they were captured and sent to Babylon, where his eyes were put out before he watched all of his sons, or after watching all of his sons be killed. Nebuchadnezzar, this is just a stele that has, an obelisk. It has the writing that makes reference to invading Judea, capturing Jerusalem, and destroying its temple. Just another archaeological artifact. The dynasties, the divided kingdom. Israel had 9 different dynasties. Judah always had one. That was always the line of David. 19 kings, a queen. Throw in a queen, throw in a governor. It ends up being a little bit higher number, 40 people. But the number of years before captivity. And here, you think about this. This is 135 years difference. You would think that Judah would say, look what happened. We should correct our behavior. But it doesn't happen. The northern kingdom is captured by Assyria, the southern kingdom by Babylon. Okay, next. And we're almost done. Here's just a chart of the house of David. You can see all of how this plays out. It's kind of confusing maybe in some ways, but just another way of showing that lineage. Next. Here's just another chart where it lists each of the different kings from Israel and Judah. Actually, I should have put these in opposite columns because all the way along I've been doing Judah on the left and Israel on the right. And here I should have been more careful about that. Sorry, but that helps make sense. I think we're almost to the end here. I think this is the last slide. The post-exilic events. In 539, Babylon falls to the Medes. Cyrus of Persia sends the first wave of Jews back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel. The temple rebuilding begins. Okay? In 478, Esther convinces the Persian king Xerxes to allow Jews to defend themselves while in captivity. In 458, the priest Ezra leads the group of exiles back. They rebuild the altar. They begin sacrifices and part of the restoration of the temple. But they didn't get very far. Opposition halts for 15 years until Darius supports the completion of the temple. It's under Haggai and Zechariah. In 445, Artaxerxes sends his Jewish official Nehemiah to Jerusalem. They rebuild the wall in 52 days. Ezra reads the book of the law to the people, the covenant's renewed. And then this is trying to put a date on that, 398, Ezra leads a second group of exiles back. They have what I call the Great Divorce, because of the intermarriage between Jews and pagan wives. They have a mass divorce. And then comes sort of a quiet intertestamental period. We see Sparta declining, Philip and Alexander conquer the world. The Greeks, right? And then the 4 generals who are left divide the kingdom. The Punic Wars see the decline of Greece and the rise of Rome until finally, in the 3rd Punic War, Rome takes over. And then we see the New Testament beginning. Okay?
So the divorce would mean they would have to get rid of their wives?
Yeah.
That would be it. Just because of the bloodline?
Just because of
the bloodline?
No,
The
because
children?
they had
Because of the
married.
pagan.
They had married outside of Jewish.
And they were following.
Yeah. That bloodline. They
Right.
married outside of
Right,
Jews.
yeah.
So how would they get rid of them?
They divorced them.
I know,
They just divorced them.
what does that mean?
No. It was a divorce, not a death.
Okay, I was just wondering.
But it created, it was a major
Yeah.
problem, challenge. Yeah. Let's take a break. We went long. Oh, we'll pick this up later. Let's take a break.
One of the problems with
Okay, let's begin with the second half. I won't keep you as long for the full thing, but what I thought when we first mapped out what this course would look like, we wanted to begin with a theological overview and end with a theological overview. And from Vern, Dr. Raaflaub doing the work, the second half of that first night, beginning with Genesis. Now we've come really to the end of the overview of the scriptures. But what I thought might be helpful, a little bit different approach, would be to just look at some of the words. That as we look at the words, so that you can understand some of the background of what those key words are in the Old Testament narrative, that by walking through that, it'll give you an idea of what some of the theological concepts are behind that. I'm not sure. I've not done this particular piece before. I do it often in little bits. When we're in Bible class, I'll often say, well, this word in Hebrew is, and that's the meaning. But this is just a whole kind of a glossary of keywords. And they're arranged in a sort of oddly topical approach. So you might say, why are we sort of skipping around from one place to the next? But so hopefully these will help you understand His story. That's part of the title. It's really God's story, the Old Testament, as we look at history. Let's look at the next slide, God's names. And I don't have a good, PowerPoint doesn't have a good translator to a Hebrew font. So these don't look like really good Hebrew. It's a weak one. But I downloaded a different Hebrew font, and I just couldn't get it to work in PowerPoint. So, but that's probably about my age. And if I were 13, I could figure out the technology things. But I'm just a little too old for that. So the most common names for God, Elohim. And by the way, this is plural. When it ends in I-am, it's usually a plural in Hebrew. But it doesn't mean that they're gods. It's one God, but this plural sense. And we think about Elohim having the concept of triune God, right? And so that plurality is there. Another name, the personal name for God, this is Yahweh. You've probably been familiar with that. We often see it as YHWH, but it's the personal name for God more than the royal name. And according to